Cicero, Selected Works, by Penguin Classics. On Duties, Number 2, A Practical Code, page 161. The most thorough analysis of moral obligations is unquestionably that of Panaetius, and on the whole, with certain modifications, I have followed him. The questions relating to this topic, which arouse most discussion and inquiry, are classified by Panaetius under 3 headings. Is a thing morally right or wrong? Is it advantageous or disadvantageous? And if apparent right and apparent advantage class, what is to be the basis for our choice between them? Panaetius wrote a 3-part treatise about the first 2 of these questions. The third question he said he would deal with in its proper time, but he never fulfilled his promise. This seems to me all the more surprising because he was still alive 30 years after the publication of his first 3 parts works, and his pupil, Posidonius, records this. Posidonius himself briefly refers to the subject in certain notes, but it seems to me strange that he too did not deal with it at greater length, for he expressed the opinion that there is no more vital theme in the whole range of philosophy. Now, one theory is that Panaetius did not overlook this problem, but that his omission was deliberate, indeed that no discussion on the subject was required, since the possibility of a clash between right and advantage does not exist. Personally, I cannot agree with such a view, or rather this last point could raise legitimate doubts. Had Panaetius been right to include its 3rd heading in its classification, could he not instead have omitted it altogether? But the other fact is incontrovertible. The subject was included in his classification, and yet he never dealt with it. If someone draws up a triple classification and completes 2 parts of his threefold task, he obviously still has a 3rd ahead of him. Besides, at the end of his 3rd part, Panaetius actually promises that he will deal with the 3rd topic at the proper time. At this point, Posidonius is a reliable witness. In one of his letters, he quotes a famous remark of Publius Rutilius Rufus, himself a pupil of Panaetius, about the painting of the Venus of Cos. No painter, said Rutilius, had ever been able to complete that part of the picture which Apelles had left unfinished, since the beauty of Venus's face made the adequate representation of the rest of her hopeless task. Similarly, the quality of what Panaetius had written was so outstanding that nobody was able to supply his omissions. What Panaetius intended then is not in doubt, but whether he had been justified when at the outset he included his 3rd heading in his program for the study of moral obligations may well be, as I have said, a matter of discussion. The Stoics believe that right is the only good. Your Peripatetics, on the other hand, hold that right is the highest good, to the degree that all other things collected together scarcely begin to weigh down the balance on the other side. Now, according to either doctrine, there can be no doubt whatever about one point. Advantage can never conflict with right. That is why Socrates, as the tradition goes, used to curse the men who had first begun to differentiate between these things, which nature had made inseparable. The Stoics agreed with him, for their view is that everything which is morally right is advantageous, and there can be no advantage in anything which is not right. Those, on the other hand, whose yardstick of desirability is pleasure or absence of pain, say that right is only worth cultivating as a source of advantage. If Panaetius were the kind of man to hold this same opinion, he might argue that clash between right or advantage are conceivable. However, he is not that sort of thinker at all. On the contrary, he interprets right as the only good and judges that things which conflict with this, however advantageous they may look, can in fact make life neither better by their presence nor worse by their absence. So we reach the conclusion, after all, that there was no need for Panaetius to deal with the comparison between what is right and what appears falsely to be advantageous. Besides, the Stoics' ideal is to live consistently with nature. I suppose what they mean is this. Throughout our lives, we ought invariably to aim at morally right courses of action, and insofar as we have other aims, also, we must select only those which do not clash with such courses. That is another reason why, according to the school of thought that I mentioned, there ought never to have been any question of weighing advantage against right, and the whole topic ought to have been excluded from any philosophical discussion. However, there is more to the matter than that, for moral goodness, in the truest and fullest sense of the word, goodness and right being wholly synonymous, could only be found among those hypothetical people who are endowed with ideal wisdom. Nobody who falls short of this perfect wisdom can possibly claim perfect goodness. Its semblance is the most he can acquire. And these are the men, the ordinary men, falling short of the idea, whose moral obligations form the subject of my present work. The Stoics call these second-class obligations. They are incumbent upon everyone in the world so that their application cannot be wider. And what is more, natural decency and progress and understanding enable many people to live up to these obligations. On the one hand, there is an ideal unlimited obligation, the perfect obligation, as the Stoics put it, satisfying all the numbers, which none but the ideally wise man can fulfill. And then there are also these other actions in which we see the working of a second-class obligation. When the latter situation arises, there is often a very general impression that here too an ideal action has been performed. Most people fail to understand that. In fact, the deed falls short of the ideal. Their intelligence is insufficient to appreciate what is lacking. Judgments of poems, paintings, and much else reveal the same fault. Uninformed readers and viewers admire and praise things that they do not deserve to be praised. For evidently, ignorant people can grasp such merits as these poems and pictures, and so on may possess without being capable of detecting their deficiencies. What they need is expert instruction, and then they quickly revise their opinions. The obligations, then, which I am discussing in this book, are those related by the Stoics to the second class of goodness, which is not the exclusive possession of the hypothetical main idea of wisdom, but it is relevant to the whole of mankind. That is to say, everyone who is not devoid of good is prompted by obligations of this sort. Take, for example, the two Decius, or the two Scipios. We call them brave men, and we describe Gaius Fabricius Lucianus as just. But this does not mean that they are perfect models of bravery or justice as one truly wise man would be. For none of them were wise in the ideal, since we are here attributing to that word, nor was Cato the censor, nor was Gaius Laelius, although they received names indicating that they were so regarded. Even the 7 wise men were not wise in this sense. They merely bore a certain resemblance to wise men, because of their consistent performance of second-class obligations. Now it is mistaken, we know, to weigh what is ideally right against apparent advantage when the two things are in conflict. An apparent advantage should equally not be weighed against the second class sort of right which is cultivated by everyone who aspires to a reputation for goodness. For we are morally bound to cherish and observe the degree of right, which comes within our comprehension just as carefully as the ideal wise man is obligated to cherish what is right in the full and ideal sense of the word, because that is the only way in which we can maintain whatever progress we have made towards achieving goodness. So much then for people who fulfill their moral obligations sufficiently well to be regarded as good. But those who habitually weigh the right course against what they regard as advantageous are in quite a different category. Unlike good men, they judge everything by profits and gains, which seem to them to be as valuable as what is right. Venantius observed that people often doubtingly weigh those two things against one another. I'm sure he meant just what he said, that they often do this, not that they ought to. For preferring advantage to right is not the only crime. It is also sinful, even to attempt a comparison between the two things, even to hesitate between them. But can there be a sort of contingency warranting doubts and special consideration? I believe that there can. Certain situations are perplexingly difficult to assess. On occasion, a course of action generally regarded as wrong turns out not to be wrong after all. Let me quote a particular instance, which admits a wider application. There could be no more terrible crime than to kill someone who is not merely a fellow human being but a close friend. Yet surely someone who kills a tyrant, however close the two men have been, has not committed a crime. At any rate, the people of Rome do not think so, since they regard that deed which was done as the most splendid of all noble actions. Has advantage then in this case prevailed over right? No, advantage has come from right. All the same, there are occasions of which advantage, as we understand the term, will give the impression of clashing with what we interpret as right. In order to avoid mistaken conclusions when this happens, we must establish some rule to guide us in comparing the two things, and to keep us true to our obligations. That rule will be in accordance with the teaching and system of the Stoics. They are my models in this work, and I will tell you why. It is true that the early members of the Academy and your Peripatetics, who were at once indistinguishable from them, regard right as preferable to apparent advantage. But the Stoics go further and actually identify advantage with right, insisting that a thing must be right before it can be advantageous. This treatment of the subject is more impressive than the peripatetic and early academic beliefs that some particular good actions may not be advantageous, and some advantageous actions may not be good. I, however, belong to the new academy, which allows wide latitude to adopt any theory supported by probability. But to return to my rule. Well then, to take something away from someone else to profit by another's loss is more unnatural than death, or destruction, or destitution, or pain, or any other physical or external blow. To begin with, this strikes at the roots of human society and fellowship. For if we gain of us propose to rob or injure one another foe or personal gain, then we are clearly going to demolish what is more emphatically nature's creation than anything else in the whole world, namely the link that unites every human being with one another. Just imagine if each of us of our limbs had its own consciousness and saw advantage for itself in appropriating the nearest limb's strength. Of course, the whole body would inevitably collapse and die. In precisely the same way, a general seizure and appropriation of other people's property would cause the collapse of human community, the brotherhood of man. Granted that there is nothing unnatural in a man preferring to earn a living for himself rather than for someone else, what nature forbids is that we should increase our own means, property, resources by plundering others. Indeed, this idea, that one must not injure anybody else for one's own profit, is not only natural law, as international valid principle. The same idea is also incorporated in the statutes which individual communities have framed for their national purposes. The whole point and intention of these statutes is that one citizen shall live safely with another. Anyone who attempts to undermine that association is punished with fines, imprisonment, exile, or death. The same conclusion follows even more forcibly from nature's rational principle, the law that governs gods and men alike. Whoever obeys this principle, and everyone who wants to live according to nature's laws must obey it, will never be guilty of coveting another man's goods or taking things from someone else and appropriating them for himself. For great-heartedness and heroism and courtesy and justice and generosity are far more in conformity with nature than self-indulgence or wealth or even life itself. But to despise this latter category of things, to attach no importance to them in comparison with the common good, really does need a heroic and lofty heart. In the same way, it is more truly natural, to model oneself on Hercules, and undergo the most terrible labors and troubles in order to help and save all the nations of the earth. Then, however superior you are in looks or strength, to live a secluded, untroubled life with plenty of money and pleasures. And mankind was grateful to Hercules for his services. Popular belief gave him a place among the gods. That is to say, the finest and noblest characters prefer a life of dedication to a life of self-indulgence. And one may conclude that such men conform with nature, and are therefore incapable of doing harm to their fellow men. A man who wrongs another for his own benefit can be explained in two ways. Either he does not see that what he is doing is unnatural, or he refuses to agree that death, destitution, pain, and the loss of children, relations, and friends are less deplorable than doing wrong to another person. But if he sees nothing unnatural in wrongdoing a fellow man, is he not beyond the reach of argument? He is taking away from human beings all that makes them human. If, however, he concedes that this ought to be avoided, yet still regards death, destitution, and pain as even more undesirable, he is mistaken. He ought not to concede that any damage, either to his person or to his property, is worse than a moral failure. So everyone ought to have the same purpose, to identify the interests of each with the interest of all. Once men grab from themselves, human society will completely collapse. But if nature prescribes, as she does, that every human being must help every other human being, whoever he is, just precisely because they are all human beings, then by the same authority all men will have identical interests. Having identical interests means that we are all subject to one and the same law of nature, and that being so, the very least that such a law enjoins is that we must not wrong one another. This conclusion follows inevitably from the truth of the initial assumption. If people claim, as they sometimes do, that they have no intention of robbing their parents or brother for their own gain, but that robbing their other compatriots is a different matter, they are not talking sense. For that is the same as denying their common interests with which their fellow countrymen and all the legal and social obligations and societal that follow therefrom, a denial which shatters the whole fabric of national life. Other objection urges that one ought to take account of compatriots but not of foreigners. The people who put forward these arguments subvert the whole foundation of the human community, and its removal means the annihilation of all kindness and generosity and goodness and justice, which is a sin against the immortal gods, since they were the creators of the society which men are seeking to undermine. And the tightest of the bonds uniting the society is the belief that robbery from another man for the sake of one's personal gain is more unnatural than the endurance of any loss whatsoever to one's person or property, or even to one's very soul. That is, provided that no violation of justice is involved, seeing that of all the virtues, justice is the sovereign and queen. So let us consider possible objections. Suppose a man of great wisdom were starving to death. Would he not be justified in taking food belonging to someone who is completely useless? Suppose an honest man had the chance to steal the clothes of a cruel and inhuman tyrant, like Phalaris, and needed them to avoid freezing to death. Should he not do so? These questions are very easy to answer.